Okay, thank you very much, Manuele, and thank you, Flavio, for inviting me to speak here about our work in competition in Argentina. So I started working at the Commission in 2016 as head of competition advocacy, and it was kind of a big challenge because this was the first time a unit of advocacy was set up in the antitrust authority in Argentina. So everything was to be built there. So one of the activities that we have in the unit is market studies, and we worked a lot on this during the last 3-4 years. We studied many sectors and we learned lots of lessons from those studies. So what I want to share with you today is some cases, some examples that we have looked at during this period, and draw some conclusions on what is the role that market studies can play on improving competition in markets, and what conditions we need to make market studies more effective in creating a more competitive environment. So, okay. So I will start by very, very briefly giving you some idea of what the competition law is in Argentina, and what are the provisions for market studies. And then I will go through 2 cases. If I have time, I can talk about a third one, but mainly 2 cases. So Argentina competition law is quite similar to European law. So so the objective of the law is to punish conducts that are detrimental to the general economic interest. That's what the law says. And we interpret as competition authority this general economic interest as economic efficiency and consumer welfare. So this is what we want to protect from the competition authority, and market studies are going to look at those at this general economic interest stuff. So in terms of market studies, the law gives us some powers to conduct market studies, to promote competition studies. So we can, for example, hire external consultants to give us some ideas or some studies. And to issue opinions and pro-competitive recommendations on functionings of the market. These recommendations are non-binding recommendations, so we say what we think would be better for competition, but we cannot make sure that those recommendations will be implemented. And just recently, in January this year, we have issued some guidelines for how market studies should be conducted in the authority. So this is basically a very fast framework of our methodology for market studies. So we can start a market study. So we have a differentiation between a market study and a market investigation. So market study is basically based on public information. We do not make information requests or hearings at this stage. Sometimes we may hire an external consultant to make this market study. And this is used as an initial diagnosis that will give us an idea of whether we need to go deeper on analyzing that particular market. And then, sorry, if we think there is need to a further deeper investigation, we would open a formal proceeding within the Commission, which we call a market investigation. And that's what we do in our unit. And that usually ends with recommendations to other public bodies or maybe some private actors in the market. And then there is the third part, which is beyond our control, which is implementation and the impact on the market. So, as I said at the beginning, we worked a lot with market studies during this 3-year period. So here, just an idea of all the sectors that we have looked at. On the left are those studies that have not moved on to the second stage, the market investigation stage. And on the right, all the market investigations that we have done during this period. In blue are those that have been finished and published, and in black are those that are still going on. And I'm going to talk today about those 2 of these investigations. The first one is the credit and debit cards market. And the first in the list, and the second one will be the last on the list, and that is because we have learned lots of things from those 2 in particular. So the first, as I said, I will talk is credit cards and electronic means of payment market. This was finished in 2016. So what is this this study about? So just an introduction about the general framework for analysis, which is the bilateral market, just in case somebody is not familiar with this. So here, basically, if we think of a credit card market, then the story goes. It's a complicated market because you have a brand here that could be Visa or MasterCard, and then you have these 2 sides of the market that have different functions in the market. So on the one side, you have this the card holder that is going to use the card for payment, and in order to have the card, it needs to have a connection with an issuer of the card. And then on the other side, you have the seller or the merchant who is going to receive the payment with the credit card. And for that, he needs to be on the network of the brand, and the acquirer is the person that puts the merchant in this network. And so here you have the money flow with this structure, and what I want to make to point out here 2 particular prices that are going to be important in the market and in our investigation in particular, which are this A here, which is the interchange fee, and this M, which is the merchant discount fee. So what are these 2 prices? So M is the price that the seller is going to pay the acquirer for the service of being connected to the network. This is usually computed as a percentage of the price of the amount of the sale. And then you have the interchange fee, which is a payment that goes from the acquirer to the issuer. And why is that fee there? Well, the reason the fee is there is that when you have this bilateral structure, then you have that it is optimal from a profit maximization point of view to set different prices on both sides of the market, and you want to set a higher price to the side that has the lowest demand elasticity, and that is usually this side, the merchant side. So this interchange fee is going to compensate the other side, the issuer, because this guy is basically collecting all the income of this market, and then it will give some to the issuer who is really not collecting much because of this difference in prices based on size. So now I go to the case that we have analyzed. So this is market shares of credit card transactions in 2015, before the investigation in Argentina. So you see that this is measured in value of transactions. So you see that Visa is the most important brand in Argentina with 58% of share. And then followed by MasterCard with a very, very, very lower percentage of 11%. So Visa is really the dominant brand in Argentina. So one tricky point in this market was about market definition. There are many ways you can define markets in these bilateral structure networks, and what I mean, the object, what we want to do, what type of competition you want to look at, is going to be very important in how you want to define markets. So here we have defined 5 different markets in this investigation. So one market for issuing services, and the main actors here are the banks, national banks, and a different market for acquiring services. So those that put sellers on the network, and here for those two, for being able to operate in these 2 markets, you need a license from the card brand. Then there is a market for transaction processing services. So this is the service that allows the transaction to go from the acquirer and from the issuer to the brand and gets validated. And then there's a market of online payment services. So these are companies that offer a platform for making online payments. Like an example of this is PayPal is one of the companies that offers these services. And finally, there's another market for interfaces for card payments. So these are the physical infrastructure that you need to pay with a credit card, and that could be a POS terminal if you are paying in person, or it could be a gateway if you are doing your payment on the internet. So these are different markets, and there are different actors in each of these markets. And Argentina had a very particular structure of ownership and integration in all these markets. So colors in this picture represent the same economic group. So you see a lot of blue colors here and some green, and then the rest is really not important. So what are the blues? This company here, PRISMA, is or was at that time the only company allowed to market in Argentina the Visa brand. So if you wanted to have a Visa, to be able to sell using a Visa, you needed to go to PRISMA, who would give you the authorization. PRISMA also is the only one that was able to process transactions made with the Visa card. And moreover, PRISMA was also owned by 14 national banks, which were issuers of the Visa brand and also the MasterCard brand. So you see there are integrations, vertical integrations, and also bilateral integration here. This company also offered a POS to the merchants and also a gateway for online payments. And it also had a company that offered platforms for online payments. So it was everywhere in all relevant markets. And the thing here was that in these two markets, PRISMA was a monopoly. First Data, the yellow one, had the same role as PRISMA for MasterCard, except that it wasn't in all markets, and in particular, it had no relation to the issuing banks. So this is just to give you an idea of PRISMA's shareholders, all the national banks. These are the largest banks in Argentina here, privately owned banks, publicly owned banks, everything was here. Okay, so we identified quite a lot of competition issues here. First of all, the dominant position of PRISMA, in particular monopoly position in the acquiring and processing services for Visa. And remember that Visa was the most important brand in Argentina. This integration with the main national banks that were the owners. And this second point, this integration with national banks, had a consequence of high entry barriers in the acquiring services market. And why is that? Because if you think of the margin of the acquiring services, the margin is basically the difference between what the acquirer receives from the merchant discount fee, and what the acquirer has to pay to the issuing banks, the interchange fee. And in the case of PRISMA, since the banks were the owners, the interchange fee really didn't matter, because it was just a change from PRISMA to its shareholders, so it stayed in the family. And therefore, what PRISMA did was to set a very high interchange fee, so that the margin in the acquiring services market was very, very low, and then nobody has interest in entering this market and compete. So high barriers to entry, but it was endogenous and generated by the structure of the market. And we identify a potential abuse of dominant position by PRISMA, some refusal to process payments that came from competing firms in the online payment services market, and some also potential collusion between the shareholders of PRISMA in setting interest rates for payments with a Visa card. So our conclusion in this study was a series of recommendations, especially to the Argentine Central Bank, which is the regulator of this market. And so we recommended to regulate the interchange fee, to regulate open access to processing services, so to avoid this refusal of processing from competing providers, to promote entry in acquiring services, and to facilitate multi-brand acquiring, so that acquirers could acquire more than one brand instead of only one. And then we also opened an antitrust investigation against PRISMA and against their shareholders for the problems I just mentioned. So what happened after the study? The important thing about this this study is that it was initiated because the central bank was worried about competition on this market. So we had a strong cooperation with the central bank during this this market study, and basically coordinated with them the recommendations, and so it was very easy to implement recommendations afterwards. And if you look at the market right now, then you see that the central bank has regulated the interchange fee, and so that has increased the acquiring margin and reduced barriers to entry. Now you have multi-brand acquiring, so PRISMA is an acquirer of Visa and MasterCard, and First Data the same thing. And then the central bank has also promote development of many other different ways of electronic payments besides credit cards. And on the other side, the case against PRISMA was closed with a commitment offered by PRISMA, and as a consequence, PRISMA was sold to a new company that is not a combination of two or more commercial banks, which was the problem that we have identified. Okay, so the second case I wanted to talk about is a supermarket. This was finished in 2019, and it was initiated basically because there was a kind of general wisdom that supermarkets are the bad guys and they are everywhere colluding to set prices, and so that's the reason why we opened this in this investigation. And the first thing that was interesting was that in Argentina, supermarkets account for only 30% of sales, of retail sales. So they're not really that important as sellers, as retailers. We identified different. So our conclusion was, in terms of market, was that supermarkets were a different market from other retail formats, and this is true if you look at the supermarket from the downstream or from its relation to final consumers, because supermarkets sell a much wider variety of goods than other contracts, that other formats. And then also true if you look at the story on the upstream or the relation with the suppliers, because the supermarket for suppliers works like a window to exhibit products. So if you're a supplier and you put your supplier on the supermarket shelves, then that's kind of a sales campaign. So we identified that it is appropriate to separate supermarkets from other formats when you talk about relevant markets. So when you look at supermarkets in Argentina, you see that it is not that concentrated a sector. So the biggest chain is Carrefour with 20%, and then you have a lot of smaller chains. So what we investigated basically two things here. One is this idea that supermarkets may be colluding to set prices. So we did a price analysis with a data set that has daily prices for a set of products in all the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires. And the data set went from May 2016 to October 2016. And we selected 5 product categories, and we did lots of workings with this data set. And one thing we showed here is what is the probability of observing a simultaneous price change, I mean in the same day, in 2 different stores. And so what we find is that this probability is only 16.5% if the stores belong to different chains, so completely independent. It goes up to 40% if stores belong to the same chain, but different brands within the chain. And it goes up to 62% if the stores belong to the same brand within a chain. So basically, when you see prices moving together, it corresponds to cases in which the stores are owned by the same group. Basically, our price analysis does not support the collusion hypothesis, and you can see here that there are some brands that are mostly cheap in some categories, but expensive in some other categories. For example, here brand 3 is cheap for oil and yogurt, but it is expensive in terms of beer and dry pasta. So there's not really homogeneous behavior on prices on these supermarket chains. Okay, let me skip this one. So basically, the price analysis does not support the collusion general wisdom that was going around. And the second thing we looked at was what is the relation between supermarkets and the suppliers. So here there are many things that are interesting, and for of course the first one is that there's no one supplier in a supermarket that has a very big share of the supermarket sales. Like the largest supplier accounts for no more than 6% of supermarket sales. But if you look at product categories, then you can identify clear market leaders with shares that may go above 50%. So we have identified many problems in the relation between suppliers and the supermarket, and these problems are basically they are for the smaller suppliers. So with smaller suppliers, supermarkets tend to have some buyer power, and they exploit this buyer power in this relationship. And so we see that there are very few written agreements with suppliers, and there are many unilateral changes in conditions, so supermarkets unilaterally decide to change things, there is a problem with the commercial discounts that supermarkets do to the suppliers. There's a lack of transparency. They are mostly discretionary. It's difficult to audit and to trace down where those discounts come from. There are too long payment terms, and in Argentina, with high inflation, that's really, really a huge problem. And there are other problems related to logistics, like supermarkets make the trucks of the small suppliers wait long in queue when want to put the merchandise, and also ask the suppliers to pay for the reposition of products in the shelves. So our recommendation was to write a supply code of practice in this industry that would regulate the relation between the supermarkets and the suppliers, and basically trying to address all these issues that we have identified. Now, the thing here is that this has not been done, and we are not seeing anyone working on trying to put this code of practice into work. So let me skip the last one because I don't have time. And so, conclusions. So what we have learned from these studies. First, that these market studies have been useful to assess competition conditions in the markets, to identify potential infringements of the competition law. So credit card is an example, but not the only one that has become an antitrust investigation. And also to confirm or debunk myths, like what I was talking about supermarkets. Now, the real impact on the market of these market studies is very much associated with the degree of cooperation with the implementation body. And in the case of credit cards, we could go on implementing easily because of this cooperation with the central bank. But in the supermarkets case, we haven't seen any real impact on the market because our recommendations have not been taken. And the third point is that we have to be aware of potential political constraints to implement our recommendation. And in this sense, we think that market studies must be complemented with a lot of advocacy work on explaining the benefits of competition, because sometimes we have recommendations and people just don't understand why that would be at all useful in making consumers better. So that's all I have to say. I thank you very much for being here.